Hello everyone, a very good evening to all of you. So in the morning session, we talked about the previous year concepts in respiratory physiology. So if you have not watched the video, kindly go and watch the video. So now we are going to apply the concept, whatever we learned in the morning. So without further delay, I'll move in. So most of the times, as I told you, you're going to get case-based scenario questions. So these kind of 4-line questions or 5-line questions is going to be very common because the examiner will try to put you under pressure by asking these kind of questions so that you can spend more amount of time in a particular question. So always identify the keywords and try to answer the questions fast. Okay, so this case, a 65-year-old smoker, okay, a chronic smoker, the patient is having increased TLC, total lung capacity, increased residual volume, decreased FEV1 to FVC ratio, and there was mild hypoxemia, and there was a near normal partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So moving back to the morning session, we talked about what is ventilation to perfusion ratio. Okay, so in this case, there is decreased FEV1, forced expiratory volume. Okay, forced expiratory volume, one indicates the first second. Okay, FVC is the total expiratory capacity. Okay, the total speed, expiratory capacity, that is called as FVC. So what happens, the patient is having difficulty in expiration. Okay, the patient is having difficulty in expiration, and the total lung capacity and residual volume is increased. So what happens, because of the perfusion abnormality in the blood, the oxygen cannot enter from the lungs to the blood, and because the carbon dioxide can diffuse very fast, that is, it diffuses more than 20 times faster than the oxygen, it easily diffuses from the blood vessel to the lungs. Okay, so the partial pressure of carbon dioxide remains normal because it can easily diffuse, but the oxygen cannot enter the blood because the perfusion is not good, the perfusion ratio is abnormal. So in this scenario, it is a case of emphysema. So the ventilation perfusion ratio is infinite, which means ventilation is good. I breathe normally. My oxygen, I am taking enough amount of oxygen, but because of the abnormality in the perfusion, the blood vessel, abnormality in the blood vessel, the oxygen does not enter the blood vessel. It stays inside the lungs. That is what we call it as dead space. Okay, so the ventilation perfusion ratio is infinite, which is nothing but dead space. What do you mean by dead space? The patient will be having normal inspiration, normal oxygen inside the lungs or alveoli, but the exchange does not take place. The oxygen does not enter the blood vessel because there is abnormality in the blood vessel. Then you can ask me how the carbon dioxide alone comes out of the blood vessel to enter the lungs, right? That is why, as I told you, the carbon dioxide has it diffuses very fast, 20 times more. It squeezes very little amount of blood, the carbon dioxide comes out. So that is why you get a near normal partial pressure of carbon dioxide and you get hypoxemia. So these patients, they have difficulty or obstruction in their lungs. Okay, so this is a classic case of emphysema, and the ventilation perfusion ratio is infinite. There is a dead space, and so there is increased physiological dead space in this situation. So if you have any doubts, you can just go to the previous video, watch the concepts of what is ventilation perfusion ratio and what are the vital capacities, lung volumes. You'll get an idea of it. Okay. So moving on to the next question. Carbon dioxide in the blood is carried mainly as. So as I told you, the food, the carbohydrates and the fats, what we take, it has more of carbon, hydrogen plus oxygen. So the hydrogen is taken up by the body and it is supplied to the electron transport chain where it undergoes oxidative phosphorylation. It produces more amount of ATP. Whereas this carbon plus oxygen, they should be carried to the lungs. I should exhale it. I don't need carbon dioxide. So what happens? It enters the blood and it combines with the water to form carbonic acid, which in turn breaks into hydrogen ions plus bicarbonate. Okay, hydrogen ions plus bicarbonate. So the carbon dioxide is mainly carried in the bloodstream in the form of bicarbonate. 70% of the times it is carried in the bloodstream via bicarbonate. Okay, so this situation we talked about what is respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. See, whenever there is an increased carbon dioxide, There's going to be increased hydrogen ions. There's going to be acidosis. Whenever there is decreased carbon dioxide, hypoventilation, there is going to be decreased hydrogen ions, alkalosis, respiratory alkalosis. Okay. So moving on to the next MCQ, the lung volume or capacity not measured by spirometer. Spirometer is basically a device that measures the amount of air inhaled and exhaled by the patient. Okay, it measures the amount of air inhaled and exhaled. But only drawback of a spirometer is it cannot measure the residual air which is present in the lungs. It can just measure the air which is exhaled and inhaled. It cannot measure the air which is present in the lungs. Okay, so if you take a look at that situation, recap: functional residual capacity. What is functional residual capacity? It is a combination of expiratory reserve volume plus the the amount of air which is present in the lungs, the residual volume. So functional residual capacity is a combination of expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. So as I told you, the spirometer can measure the air which can be inhaled and exhaled. It cannot measure the air which is present inside the lungs. What is residual volume? The amount of air which is present inside the lungs after forced expiration. So it measures to about 1.5 liters. Okay, so as a result, a functional residual capacity cannot be measured by a spirometer. Okay, so I talked about what are the lung capacities and volumes. So you can also watch that in the previous videos. Now, inspiratory muscle involved during quiet breathing. Okay, see, a normal breathing, only one muscle is involved. Okay, diaphragm. So diaphragm is the only muscle that is involved during quiet breathing. Okay, so what happens, as I told you, there is something called as atmospheric pressure. There is something called as intrapulmonary pressure. Okay, the atmospheric pressure is 760 mmHg and the intrapulmonary pressure is 760 mg. So it is almost the same. So wherever there is a pressure drop, the air is going to come in. So whenever there is a pressure movement, that is air movement towards the area where the pressure is less, so the movement of the air will be from the area of the greater pressure to the lesser pressure areas. So during inspiration, what happens is the diaphragm contracts. Okay, so the diaphragm, it contracts. So diaphragm will be here. Okay, so the diaphragm, it contracts. So what happens, this volume, the pulmonary volume, intrapulmonary volume, the lung volume, it increases, expands. So because of the expansion, what happens, there is a drop in the intrapulmonary pressure. It drops by 1 mm, it goes to 759 mm. So as I told you, air moves from higher pressure to lower pressure. So inside the lungs, here now it is lower pressure, so air is going to come inside the lungs. Similarly, the diaphragm relaxes, the opposite reaction takes place. The pressure is going to increase by 761 mm, 1 mm. So the air moves out of the lungs to the atmosphere. So this is what is happening in inspiration and expiration. So again, the quiet respiration is taken control by only one muscle, the diaphragm. There are also other muscles involved. Say for example, you have the external intercostal muscles. External intercostal muscles is a secondary muscle. Okay, so primarily it is diaphragm. Internal intercostal muscles is responsible for forced expiration, and pectoralis is forced inspiration. So these muscles are involved in forced expiration and forced inspiration. So inspiratory muscle, quiet breathing, diaphragm. Contracts, the volume increases, pressure decreases, air comes in. Okay. So moving on to the next question. Cosmoid breathing is associated with. Okay, so as we all know, there are two situations, respiratory and metabolic. Okay, so we talked about respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. Now what is metabolic acidosis and alkalosis? Metabolic acidosis is whenever there is an increased bicarbonate. Okay, whenever there is an increased bicarbonate, there is going to be increase in the pH. Metabolic alkalosis. Whenever there is decrease in the bicarbonate, there is going to be decrease in the pH. Metabolic acidosis. So metabolic acidosis is nothing but diabetic ketoacidosis. Okay, so this is seen in case of vomiting. So patients who are having Kussmaul's breathing, the classic of diabetic ketoacidosis, these patients will have a deep rapid breathing. Okay, deep rapid breathing. Okay, so these patients, they are associated with respiratory acidosis. Okay, so small breathing is associated with respiratory acidosis, where there will be decreased bicarbonates, decreased pH, which is classic of diabetic ketoacidosis. Okay, deep rapid breathing will be there. So moving on to the next question, a 28-year-old woman at high altitude develops tachypnea and lightheadedness, and ABG shows there was low partial pressure of carbon dioxide and mild respiratory alkalosis. So what is the primary stimulus for increased ventilation? It's very simple, right? See, imagine I'm going to a hilly area. Obviously, I'm going to get decreased oxygen supply. So what will happen? I'm going to get decreased oxygen. My brain is going to signal. So something has to take place to increase the oxygen content in me. Otherwise, I'll go to syncope, or I might even die. So what happens? The body will try to cope the mechanism. So my body will stimulate or send signals via what is called as the chemoreceptors. So there are two types of chemoreceptors: peripheral and central chemoreceptors. Previous session I talked about baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are receptors present on the vessel wall, stretch receptors. They control the blood pressure, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. They send signals. They control the parasympathetic and sympathetic activities. Similarly, if you look at chemoreceptors, there are two types of chemoreceptors: peripheral and central chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors, they are the one that responds to decreased oxygen. Okay, they are carotid bodies and iotic bodies. Okay, so peripheral chemoreceptors are nothing but carotid bodies and iotic bodies. So these are peripheral chemoreceptors. They respond to decreased oxygen in the blood, and it will send signal. So body will breathe rapidly. So what happens? Tachypnea takes place as in this situation. So a woman moves to the high altitude. What happens? There is decreased oxygen. So the body sends signals via peripheral chemoreceptors. So what happens? There is tachypnea, sudden. There is fast breathing, hyperventilation. So because of the hyperventilation, the flushing of carbon dioxide takes place. The PaCO2 is reduced, and that is why the patient undergo respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory, again, decreased carbon dioxide, there's going to be decreased hydrogen ions, respiratory alkalosis. Okay, so what is our primary stimulus? Obviously, because of the reduction in the oxygen, the body tries to compensate via chemoreceptors. That is why the patient experiences tachypnea and excess flushing out of carbon dioxide, because of which there is respiratory alkalosis. Very simple, right? So you understand the concept, you are applying it here. Okay, so the next question will be, surfactant reduces the alveolar collapse. See, basically, if you look at the alveoli, they are lined by a thin fluid. Okay, this thin fluid, it causes surface tension. Okay, this causes surface tension and might even collapse during expiration. Collapse during expiration. So these surfactants, okay, they are pulmonary surfactants. They are basically produced by type 2 pneumocytes. So what is the function of these surfactants? They reduce the surface tension of the alveoli, that thereby prevent the collapse of the alveoli during the expiration. Okay, so surfactant reduces the alveolar collapse by reducing the surface tension. Okay, now the last question, forced expiration is produced primarily by the contraction of. See, forced expiration is controlled by abdominal muscles. Okay, rectus abdominis, oblique muscles. Okay, so the abdominal muscles, they control the forced expiration. So with this, we come to a conclusion of the respiratory physiology. I hope it makes sense. So we, in the morning session, we read about the concepts, and in the evening session, we are applying it. So with this, the previous year MCQs which are asked regarding or pertaining to the respiratory physiology comes to an end. So as I told you, spend 10 to 15 minutes morning and 10 to 15 minutes in the evening time, so that your preparation will go on. At the same time, you are getting exposed to the previous year questions. And don't forget to attend the test in the app. So it will be available by tonight, and you can attend the test for free, get exposed to the previous year MCQs, and crack the NEET MDS in flying colors. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.